hello. Welcome to yet another thesis video episode. I'm your host Miikka, and today I'm happy to have Juha Myllyniemi as my guest. And Juha, you are at the moment you are studying at Aalto University School of Business in a master's program in business analytics. Welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you, Miikka.
And so we are talking about contextualization, and especially in your bachelor's thesis that was titled Exploring the Supporting Factors of Expatriate Adjustment in the Game Industry, the case of a major Finnish game company.
Yep.
So if we start with a bit of context to this episode on context in a way. So like why did you choose the video game industry as your topic?
Well, a part of all of the things I had available for choosing in the international business bachelor's, I thought video games were always something I was interested in, maybe working in the industry at some point. So I thought like giving it a chance by choosing a few courses related to video games, and then maybe when I saw that there was a possibility of writing my bachelor's on the topic, of course I went for it. Initially, I didn't know what the topic would be,
Mm.
but then, of course, with the process, then I settled on a topic.
Okay, cool. And I think from there, um, everything kind of flowed quite smoothly, um, with regards like your thesis and all that. Um, so like, and I think like it's quite interesting that where you decided on expatriate adjustment in the video game industry, um, and to give a bit of background, so like Finnish video game industry has uh, how do you say increased in revenue. It has kind of grown quite rapidly during the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So how did you decide on who to interview for your thesis?
Um, well, initially going after settling on the topic, I thought, of course, I would want data on actual people who have gone through the process of moving countries in order to work for a specific game company in Finland. Then again, I did need at least a few interviewees in order to
Mm.
have relevant data. So that led to like some companies I couldn't really even think about for interviews. And then I just tried to contact a few companies in Finland that I know that actually have a sufficient amount of expatriate employees and to which I might have some connections either through university or my like personal network.
Mm. And I think that's really interesting. So kind of in a way, kind of deduction process in a way, kind of screening out those companies that do not match your criteria, and then you were left with couple relevant companies, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I think and that's really interesting. So what did you learn about contextualization and like during your thesis, like how to contextualize data and the participants, and like with the point being that how much do we tell without compromising anonymity?
Yeah, that's really interesting since we do have to tell enough so that the reader knows what we're actually talking about and what the thesis is about.
Hmm.
Uh, but then again, in my case, for example, in Finland there are not that many large gaming companies,
Yeah.
and then again, within those companies, they might only have uh, like 100 employees, give or take, depending on the company, and out of those, a smaller portion of expatriates. So of course, I have to give enough context, but then again, I can't risk anonymity, so uh, I can't remember if I left out some like more like describing details for the interviewees instead of
Mm, mm.
keeping them anonymous in my thesis.
Yeah, like how did you, for example, like if you recall, like did you deal with like the interviewees' nationality, for example? Because I remember that you interviewed also people from Finland.
Yeah,
So like those are, I guess, or I take it that it was easier in a way to talk about their nationality.
yeah. I think in the end I made the decision to just um, like split them into like Finnish nationals and expatriates.
Mm,
Uh, and if I quoted some interviewee, uh, then I gave the introduction that they were. I think I posted gender, maybe age, and maybe how long they've been living in Finland, but nothing
mm,
like that could be easily traced back to them. Like, let's see, the company has only one like Vietnamese uh, employee, so
yeah,
I didn't want to risk it there, so I just left that piece of information out for
yeah. And I guess like
anonymity.
when, yeah, like when we are talking about adjustment, people moving to a different country as expatriates, then like it's more interesting to hear about the adjustment process, right,
Yeah,
than where they are coming from.
that is also true. And for my context, I want to kind of hear from others how they, if they can see how well people are adjusting, like those that are already like finally settled in. That's why I had the
Mm.
Finnish nationals also in the uh, uh, to take part in the interviews, like how
Yeah.
they feel they're doing, and if there's something they could improve and that
Mm.
they know themselves, but just don't do it for
Mm.
some reason, or do it but it actually has negative uh, like influences or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And I think, for the for the next question, which I think you kind of touched upon already, but when you were writing the thesis, um, how did you know that what kind of information is important for the reader?
Yeah, well, I think that comes down to um, what questions do we want to answer with our thesis.
Mm,
And for my case, we want to see what were the factors that actually support or like deteriorate uh, the like adjustment period.
mm,
What makes it easier for them? What makes the period longer? What stresses them out? Um, for example, we know that if someone helps them with paperwork and it's not in their mind 24/7 after moving to a new country, that does
mm,
help the individual to adjust. And of course, we want to tell that, and then we have to back that up with data that is like in the context. So if someone of my that I interviewed answers regarding to that, then of course
mm,
that's interesting piece of data. Also, if they don't mention that at all,
mm.
that's also an interesting point of data. So having that
True.
like research uh, done previously to know what might be the interesting like areas that we want to hear, what we expect to hear, and then comparing the data to that. That's
Mm.
that's how I like went with it.
Mm. As that was a nice segue as well. Like, because I was thinking that, well, I mean, you've provided quite many tips already along the chat, um, but for someone who is about to start their thesis process or already underway with the thesis, what kind of advice would you give on kind of contextualizing the research?
Yeah, uh, this is something that I was thinking like after writing my thesis, which is uh, when you're deciding on a topic, make sure that you can actually get the data. Because I was kind of panicking because I
Mm.
was limited to really like niche interviewees.
Yeah.
Um, it took me a long time and a few connections to actually get through with the interviews, and it stressed me out a lot. So
Mm.
I think be prepared that people are going to say no for interviews.
Mm.
Uh, but yeah, for the writing process and contextualizing and everything, um, I think just like having a thought like a red thread uh, flow like through the text. I
Mm.
remember at points where I lost it. I felt like I was already done with whatever I wanted to deal with, and I was still short of like 10 or 20 pages. Then I had to read through it and see what was I missing, what was already said in the interviews, but I didn't really touch upon um, on my thesis work,
Mm.
and continue on there from there.
And that's really like, well, both are really good points. Especially, because when we write, we become easily really blind, and like we get so deep or sucked so deep into what we are writing that it's just like, what am I writing again?
Yeah,
uh Juha, thank you so much. And to remind, the title of your thesis was Exploring the Supporting Factors of Expatriate Adjustment in the Game Industry, the case of a major Finnish game company. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on contextualizing your thesis. Yes, thank you so
yes.
much.
Thank you, Mika. It was a pleasure being here.